Hello, class. This is the 2050 TAP Euro Chapter 20 Industrial Revolution Test Review. It's a very short test and also a relatively short review. And I'm going to run through a quick discussion of these answers in record time, and you will be ready for this test. And so here it is. What are the precursors of the Industrial Revolution? Getting right into it. And the first question is, what role did cottage industry play in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? There were two big factors that kind of jump-started this Industrial Revolution. Of course, you had cottage industry, and you also had the Agricultural Revolution. And without those, you really weren't going to have an Industrial Revolution. So what's the big thing with cottage industry? It established a large textile market throughout England and abroad, which the Industrial Revolution could actually satisfy. And so that was really the importance of this cottage industry. You can also call cottage industry the putting out system, because that was an integral part of it. And cottage industry was a large part of the economies of Britain and other European countries. So the next question is, what role did the agricultural revolution play in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? And it was kind of a cycle. Because food production skyrocketed with a lot less labor, two things happened. Number one, there was population growth because there was more food to eat. There was also a growing available labor supply from two things: population growth and also the freeing up of labor out in the rural areas where the farming was done. And so you really had these two things that were adding fuel to the Industrial Revolution: population growth because of the Agricultural Revolution, and also a freeing up of labor. This population growth was going to add more markets, a greater demand for mass-produced things. And so what role did English geography play in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? Well, three things to keep in mind. You had large deposits of coal, large deposits of iron, and also you had access to water, including canals and rivers. So here are my heroes of the Industrial Revolution. I've got this chart. I'm going to name each inventor and quickly name what invention they came up with and what its features were, why it was important. And one thing leads to another, so it's kind of a progression. And we'll start with James Hargreaves. He invented a machine called the spinning jenny. This was hand-powered, but what it had the capability of doing was spinning fine thread. Now, you needed more power because hand power wasn't going to cut it. And so along comes Richard Arkwright. He invents a machine called the water frame. It's called the water frame because it's water powered. And that means you need to put it in a water mill next to a running river, which will power that water frame. The water frame had the capability of spinning a lot of thread, much more than just one hand-cranked spinning jenny. Problem, though, with the water frame was that it could only spin the thread so fine. It could spin coarse thread, and then you'd have to finish it off with the spinning jenny. That problem was solved by Samuel Crompton, who invented a machine called the spinning mule. That was also water-powered, and unlike the water frame, the spinning mule had the capability of spinning thread fine. And so that was a big improvement upon the water frame. Once you have the spinning mule, you're getting to the point where now the spinners can outspin the weavers. In other words, they can spin thread faster than the weavers could weave it into cloth. And that problem starts to be solved by Edmund Cartwright, who comes up with the power loom. The first power looms were powered by water, just like the water frame and the spinning mule. But eventually they were powered by steam power. And the power loom allowed weavers to weave that spun thread into cloth much, much faster. Thomas Newcomen invented the early steam engine. So the thing about the Newcomen steam engine was it was very expensive to run. It was very weak and very inefficient compared to what was going to come later. The reason that the Newcomen steam engine was so inefficient, so slow, so weak was because you've got the basic construction of a steam engine. You've got a cylinder with steam engine in it that pushes the piston when that water turns to steam, and that cylinder would have to be heated and then cooled, and then heated and then cooled in order to make the cycle run. James Watt invented the condenser. The condenser was a radical improvement upon that Newcomen steam engine, because what the condenser could do was it took steam out of that cylinder, condensed it separately outside the cylinder, and then injected condensed steam that had been condensed back into liquid into the cylinder. That kept the cylinder hot. You didn't have to waste energy heating and cooling that cylinder. And that gave the steam engine radically more speed, power, and efficiency. With James Watt's condenser, you could get almost potentially unlimited power with that steam engine. Matthew Boulton was also very important because he was a capitalist who partnered with James Watt. He made sure that James Watt got the kind of funding needed to turn this condenser steam engine into a reality. That brings us to Henry Cort. Henry Cort was an inventor who actually invented two very important things to the Industrial Revolution. One of the things he invented was the puddling furnace. In order to have an industrial revolution, you need iron. And the puddling furnace was a furnace that was capable of generating a huge amount of heat for smelting iron quickly and efficiently. The other thing that Henry Cort invented, so he invented two things, was the rolling mill. With the rolling mill, you could roll that molten iron into any shape you wanted to. So that was a huge step forward. George Stephenson invented the rocket. The rocket was a steam-powered locomotive. It wasn't the first, but it was the best. And now you've got a vehicle that is powered by steam that can haul an unlimited amount of freight, unlimited amount of passengers, with greater safety, greater efficiency. And so that's a massive boon to transportation. That's why we call George Stephenson the father of railways. Thomas Malthus was somebody who had dire predictions about this population growth and about this industrial revolution. He came up with the Malthusian growth model. And the Malthusian growth model said that the population growth will always outstrip economic growth, and people will begin to suffer. Well, what he predicted would happen, because we've been talking about this agricultural revolution and this population growth, what he predicted would happen never happened. And it's not to say that he was at fault, because he was right about all the other times that had come before. Nobody could predict just how much economic growth would be produced by this industrial revolution. Another person who had some dire warnings about the Industrial Revolution was David Ricardo, who came up with the iron law of wages. The iron law of wages said that wages would always stay at subsistence level, or just above subsistence level, and never really go higher than that. And he was right about that for about the first 70 years of the Industrial Revolution. Then about the 1840s, about 1850, wages started to go up above subsistence level, and they've been going up ever since. And so Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, two guys who had an excellent track record. They did their homework in terms of, the Malthusian growth model and the iron law of wages. It just didn't apply to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution and the economic growth that it produced outstripped their models. And so then you've got William Cockrell. William Cockrell brought the textile technology, brought this industrial technology out of Britain and into Belgium. In other words, it was through William Cockrell and his son that the Industrial Revolution jumped the English Channel and started getting into the continent of Europe. What he was doing was illegal, but it helped Belgium to be on the forefront of modernization on the continent. And then you've got Friedrich Fritz Harcourt, and he produced steam engines in the German Confederation. He was so successful that he went bankrupt because he couldn't manage his expenses. His growth, the growth of his business outstripped the capital that he could get his hands on. And when that happens, basically you can succeed your way right into bankruptcy. Happens all the time. Commentators on the Industrial Revolution, there were people who had opinions about it from various angles. For example, the Romanticists. The Romanticism is kind of the artistic movement, or maybe you might better say tone of the time. Artists and writers who had a lot to say in critique of modernity and rationalism were these Romanticists. They hated industrialization. William Blake, the Romantic poet, called the mills that he saw in England satanic, and we'll talk about that more later. The Romanticists lamented the end of the rural lifestyle and the end of the natural beauty of the earth. The Luddites. The Luddites were craftsmen and artisans who felt that their livelihood and their way of life were being threatened by industrialization. And they took their inspiration and their name from a person named Ned Ludd, of whom there's actually no solid evidence that he actually existed. And they deliberately attacked factories and destroyed the machines in them. You also had reformers such as Robert Owen. So what were three things that Robert Owen did? He brought attention to the harmful effects of factory work on children. He organized a utopian society, actually in Indiana, in the United States, that failed. All of these utopian socialists failed. He organized the first large-scale union in England, which also collapsed, but paved the way for more successful unionization later on. Government interventions regarding the Industrial Revolution. What was the role of tariffs in the Industrial Revolution? Tariffs protect homegrown industries from foreign competition. So that's a good thing for urban wage earners, but tariffs can also be used to raise the prices of necessities such as bread and grain to unreasonable levels, which is bad for the urban wage earner. And by the way, if it's bad for the urban wage earner, it's also bad for the factory owner who has to keep up with those these inflationary things. In other words, you got to pay your workers enough to live on. And if they don't have enough to live on because tariffs are so high, that's going to hurt you, the factory owner, because now you have to pay them more. So you've got this thing called the Zollverein. And what is that? And what role did it play in the Industrial Revolution? And this is a German thing. The Zollverein was an economic union, just kind of like the European Union, or kind of like NAFTA. And it was among the various states of the German Confederation. Remember, there were 39 states. Not all of them were members of this Zollverein. But the Zollverein eliminated any tariffs between members of the club, basically. And by the way, the word Verein actually means a club or a team. It raised tariffs from outside of its membership. So this made possible the phenomenal industrial growth in Germany because its budding industries were both stimulated and protected by the Zollverein. The role of this thing called limited liability in the Industrial Revolution. Limited liability, you can kind of think of it as like kind of a financial product. It was developed in Belgium, and limited liability meant that if you bought stock in a company and thereby became a part owner in that company, and that company failed, the most you could lose was the amount that your stock was worth and nothing more. Usually when companies fail, they fail big and they owe people a lot of money. They owe vendors a lot of money. And if you're part of owner in that company, maybe some people can come after you personally. But with limited liability, all you lost was the value of the stock. Nobody could come for you for any money that company still owed. And that made investors much more comfortable investing their money in industrial enterprises because their risk was relatively low. Nobody was going to come after you if that company failed. You just lost your investment. That was it. That was the limit of your liability. And so this was instrumental in generating the capital needed to stimulate the Industrial Revolution because people were more willing to invest because their risk was lower. So what did the following acts do? We've got the Mines Act, Factory Acts, Combination Acts, 10 Hours Act. The Mines Act kept women, girls, and small boys from working in those dark mines where they were vulnerable to attack and abuse. The Factory Acts brought legal age restrictions and hygiene requirements and safety requirements and hours restrictions and inspectors to the factory system. And so it was also instrumental in getting small children out of the factories. The Combination Acts, the Combination Acts were not about making life better for factory workers. The Combination Acts were actually about making life better for factory owners. The Combination Acts made unions and strikes illegal. These Combination Acts, were a product of classical liberalism, that philosophy that we talked about, which was pro-business, pro-free trade, and anti-union. All of these things are great for factory owners. All of these things are great for capitalists. And so these acts were violated so blatantly and so frequently that Parliament finally had to repeal the Combination Acts. They were doing factory owners and capitalists no good. The 10 Hours Act was an act in which factory owners were limited to making workers work a maximum 10-hour day. And this gave rise to, for example, different shifts. You had the day shift and the night shift and mid shifts because they couldn't work you, from can't see to can't see. And so some of these movements as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was not just changing technology, not just changing the way that we live or work or use energy. It was also changing us. And so you had these things, for example, class consciousness. Class consciousness is your awareness of your place in a system of social hierarchy, social classes, especially in Marxist terms, as it relates to class struggle. Karl Marx taught, and we will discuss him much more, but he taught that if you look at history, the entire history of human society is really the history of class struggle. And class consciousness is the knowledge that people in other classes are not like you in fundamental ways, particularly in the way that they think. Their dress, their speech, their manners, their values, their education, their outlook, their activities, their culture, they're all different from you. And so that is class consciousness. The charter movement. So the charter movement was a movement to give all men the right to vote, regardless of any property requirements or income requirements. Wouldn't have any of those. All men had the right to vote. Thus, the working class, in theory, if the charter movement is successful, and every man can vote regardless of whether or not he has property, regardless of whether or not he has a certain amount of income, then the working class would have some control over public policy because, let's face it, there are more men in the working class than there are in the other classes. Labor unions. Labor unions, as you know, are collective bargaining groups which could negotiate with employers, with capitalists, and create contracts with these capitalists. And so breach of contract or refusal to enter into a contract meant the workers go on strike. Classical liberalism. So classical liberalism is not like modern liberalism as we understand the word liberalism today. And in many ways, it's the exact opposite. Liberalism, as in things that made business owners more free to operate in the economy, is called classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is guided by the ideas of Adam Smith. It was highly influential among members of Parliament because Parliament consists of wealthy people, of course. And classical liberalism includes such concepts as laissez-faire, the invisible hand, no guilds, no unions. Instead, free markets, free enterprise, free competition, and minimal government intervention. And so the role of slavery, we don't tend to think of slavery as having a role in the Industrial Revolution, but slavery was still alive and well for several decades into the Industrial Revolution, and slavery interacted with the Industrial Revolution in several ways. For one thing, slavery provided raw materials to the Industrial Revolution, such as cotton, for example. And remember, textiles is a huge part of the Industrial Revolution. Slavery also stimulated the production of manufactured goods to trade for said raw materials so that there would not be a trade imbalance that could cause cash to leave the country, for example, Great Britain. It's much better to trade manufactured goods for those raw materials than it is to trade cash for those raw materials. Another way that slavery had a role in the Industrial Revolution was that profits from slavery actually funded infrastructure that supported the Industrial Revolution. Infrastructure such as roads and bridges and canals, which provided more transportation and more manufacturing jobs. That same infrastructure, the roads, bridges, canals, harbors, etc., facilitated the movement of raw materials and produced goods, which further stimulated the Industrial Revolution. So, patterns of economic growth. Let's see. Where did it start and where did it spread? I think I've got a typo here. Where did it start? Where did it spread? It began in England first, Britain, and then it spread to Belgium and the German Confederation, less so to Southern and Eastern Europe. In countries where fine craftsmanship was strong, such as France, it made less sense to mechanize because you needed really the kind of artisan skills to make things like, for example, silks and fine wines and lace that machines really couldn't do yet. What were working conditions like for, what were working conditions like for women and children in the early Industrial Revolution? It was bad. Women couldn't take care of their children at work. children were abused and injured and deformed, and their health was taken away, and they were taken out of school oftentimes to work in factories. And so, yeah, working conditions not good for women and children in the early revolution, early industrial revolution. And then finally, what were living conditions like in the industrial revolution? And that was also very bad, all the way up until about 1850. Remember that the Industrial Revolution was an urban revolution. And so these cities began to grow, and we'll talk about this much more in the next chapter, but cities began to grow phenomenally. And there was no preparation for it, no experience on how to manage that. And so people who worked in the factory system in these urban locations suffered from poor housing, filth, disease, overcrowding, no social services, and a high infant mortality rate. And so that, I believe, is all you're going to need to do great on this Chapter 20 test. Good luck on it, and we'll see you then. Bye.